Hey everyone, so this is going to be a slightly different kind of video. A few times now, myself, Blaine aka Mad Economist, and Constantine aka Oratory1990 have given a seminar at CanJam called Myths About Measurements, and we talk through some of the different issues, myths and misconceptions surrounding both measurements for source gear, measurements for headphones, and some aspects of audio theory as well. And this is going to be a slightly extended version of my section from that seminar. And before we start, I just want to clarify that the intent of this video is to try and encourage some more healthy middle ground discussions surrounding audio measurements and objective behaviors. The takeaway from this video should not be that measurements are so limited or useless that you shouldn't even bother looking at them, just use your ears. But it also should not be that measurements are so perfect that we can tell everything we need to know about a product just by looking at measurements. The point is to try and talk about some of the limitations in the measurements themselves, or areas in which we don't necessarily know where audible limits are or how to correlate certain objective behaviors and subjective characteristics, specifically so that you can make better use of measurements by understanding what they are actually telling you and what they're not telling you. Measurements nowadays are more widely available than ever before, with resources like Audio Science Review, us here at headphones.com, my own site GoldenSound.audio, or other third parties like L7 Audiolab and many more, all producing measurements on headphones and source gear and providing it in most cases for free to the general public. And more information being available is a very good thing. It means that we can test and make sure that manufacturers are being honest about what their products are actually capable of. And we can call out when manufacturers aren't being entirely truthful. It also means that we can independently validate and test specifications for different products to make sure that they are performing as claimed or doing what the consumer actually needs them to do. But the most important thing is that we can look at this data and use these measurements to help guide us towards products and purchase decisions that are more likely to suit our individual preferences. Looking at headphone frequency response measurements, for instance, to tell, even without looking at any feedback or without having heard that headphone yourself, whether you are likely to enjoy that headphone. Or maybe you know that you prefer warmer sounding amplifiers, and so you know that you need to look for amplifiers which have more second order harmonic distortion, for instance. It's not necessarily just about which measures the best, but using this data properly to actually tell you which is likely to suit your own preferences. But in my view, there are three key issues in the general discussion of audio measurements nowadays, and the first of these is that people all too often seek to rank or judge products based on a single metric or number. For source gear, this is most commonly SINAD, judging which of two DACs or amplifiers is better based on, in some cases, even just a 1 dB difference in the SINAD score, when actually there's a lot of different reasons as to why that's not a particularly appropriate thing to do, both because SINAD, as I'll show you shortly, is not a particularly perceptually relevant measurement, but also because those two scores could literally just be dependent on when the screenshot was taken. And for headphones, looking at a headphone frequency response measurement in a single line and calling things like any deviation from the Harman target objectively bad and in need of being fixed. Anything that is closer to the Harman target is demonstrably better than anything else, when the Harman research itself tells us that that is not the case. And the second issue, which also kind of compounds with the first one to make things worse, unfortunately, is that people often treat measurements as if they are absolute, as if that single SINAD figure is the exact truth, and arguing over very small differences in SINAD scores between two products, when, again, that could just be down to the moment in time the screenshot was taken, or the analyzer configuration, the test setup. And for headphones, people taking that single line frequency response and saying that any even small deviation from a target curve is obviously a fault, or if you can't hear that 6 kHz peak that's showing on this measurement quite clearly, you must just be deaf. And it's really important to know when to apply a degree of uncertainty to various different measurements and figures, and also for headphones in particular, it's really helpful to gain an understanding of the mechanics and the ways in which headphone measurements can vary depending on whose head or which rig you're measuring on. Headphones don't behave consistently, and even if you filter out the HRTF effects, the ways in which your head or a particular rig usually modifies sound in a diffuse field, there are still some unpredictable reactions between a headphone and a particular geometry of head and ear. And that can cause some very significant variations in some cases, so we'll go over that too. And the third issue is that our understanding of various different audibility thresholds and how certain objective behaviors and subjective characteristics correlate is not as certain as some people believe. And this goes both ways. There's discussions where you'll see people proclaiming as a fact that something makes a clear and obvious difference, even if all existing evidence says that it doesn't, or there's no evidence to suggest that it does, or even from a basic physics standpoint, it literally doesn't make sense and there's no way to measure or show any difference being made by that product. But then, on the other hand, and you'll often have situations where something makes a clear and obvious measurable difference, but people will say, no, that is inaudible, you cannot hear that, and proclaim that as a fact, despite the fact that there's no evidence to back up that claim either, or maybe even there is evidence that contradicts it. Let's start off with that first issue of judging or ranking products based on a single number or metric, and we'll begin with source gear and talking about SINAD. SINAD is a measure of the total amount of harmonic distortion and noise versus the intended signal, and it's usually measured by playing a 1 kHz full-scale tone through the output of the device. But the problem with SINAD is that it's not a perceptual measurement. It tells you the total amount of harmonic distortion and noise, but it doesn't actually tell you how something is going to sound or even which of two devices is going to sound worse or sound like it has more distortion. And I'm going to give you a practical demonstration of this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play you 3 tracks, or the same track 3 times, and I want you to listen on a decent pair of headphones or speakers and make a mental note of which of these you think sounds the best, which one do you think sounds like it has the least amount of distortion and noise overall, and which one you think sounds like it has the most distortion and noise overall. So I've done this demonstration at CanJam a few times now, and whilst PA speakers are always a little bit of a limiting factor, the consensus is pretty much universal that the first one is the best sounding one. That one sounds like it has the least harmonic distortion and noise overall. It's a little bit more of a toss-up between the second and third as to which is worse, but generally people tend to pick the third one. In practice though, all 3 of these have exactly the same amount of harmonic distortion and noise. The only difference is that they have a different type or structure of harmonic distortion and noise. That first one has only second order, even order harmonic distortion, and so this is a less audible kind of distortion to us, and when it is audible, generally more pleasant sounding. This is the same kind of distortion that you'll see in tube amps quite prominently, for example. The second one, I only added odd order and higher order harmonic distortion, which is why it's got that horrible scratchy, crunchy sound to it. And the third one, I didn't even add any harmonic distortion, I just added a ton of noise throughout the track. But the point here is that they all have identical SINAD values. If these were real devices, from a SINAD perspective, they would measure no differently whatsoever. And so this is a good practical demonstration of how SINAD doesn't tell us not even which of 3 devices is going to sound the best, but it doesn't even tell us which of 3 devices is necessarily going to sound like it has the least amount of distortion to us. SINAD treats all harmonic distortion and noise equally, but our human ears do not. Something with higher overall levels of distortion can sound to us like it has less distortion or still be outright more preferable. And so it's really important, particularly when you're comparing 2 devices with similar SINAD figures, to look at the structure, the type of distortion that you're seeing, because something with only second order harmonic distortion that may be a few dB higher is probably going to be more ideal than something which has maybe even slightly less distortion but much more high and odd order harmonic distortion. To put it bluntly, SINAD does not account for preference, and the best evidence for this is simply the fact that tube amps still exist. You can look at pretty much any tube amplifier and it is going to measure worse from a total harmonic distortion perspective than basically any solid state piece of equipment, and yet so many people love tube amps because the kinds of distortion that they do introduce to your music are ones that people generally find pleasurable, they find enjoyable to listen to. So SINAD is a useful figure. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use it, you absolutely should, and it is a great first step to checking the overall performance of a device. But you should not judge your purchase decisions or say that one product is definitely going to sound better than another simply because of the SINAD figure as a standalone number. And the second issue with SINAD specifically is that there are a lot of objective behaviors that are just not captured in SINAD. SINAD tells you the total amount of harmonic distortion and noise versus the signal that you are playing, and it's almost always measured with a full-scale 1 kHz tone. But if you were to measure at 16, 17 kHz, for example, that same product could perform drastically worse. There are a lot of products which, regardless of their score at 1 kHz, may perform way worse when you look at THD versus frequency, or THD versus output level, and various other factors like intermodulation distortion, which requires you to play at least 2 tones at the same time, are not factored in at all. Linearity, crosstalk, the oversampling filter in a DAC. So many factors are just not captured by SINAD, and so whilst, again, SINAD is a good first step to getting a baseline indicator of how a device is likely to perform, it does not encapsulate the complete behavior of a device, and it should never be the only thing that you look at when judging the performance of a product. And in fact, the reason that I've got the Pheromon GoldenSound edition on screen at the moment, sorry for the plug, is that it's actually quite a good example of this. So in that product, we developed a feature called spatial enhancement. And when you turn that on, it's a fairly immediately obvious change. It's quite a noticeable difference in the sound of your music. And yet, when you measure it, doing all the usual tests that you would do, SINAD, THD versus frequency, THD versus level, linearity, the oversampling filter, multi-tone testing, intermodulation, distortion, all of that stuff, none of it changes. It is exactly the same whether that feature is on or off. And that's not because the product is detecting that it's being measured and doing something different, or that we can't measure what's being changed. We can very easily. It's just that some of these basic tests are not going to capture what is actually being modified. And so if we just play some music through this device, which is what I did for this next slide, on the left you can see the comparison between two recordings of a track playing through the DAC with the feature turned off both times. And the pretty much solid green indicates that both recordings are identical. There was no difference between the two. But then the one on the right shows us the comparison between a recording with spatial enhancement on and a recording with spatial enhancement off. And as you can see here, there are some quite significant differences throughout the track. So it's not that we can't measure what's being done, we absolutely can. It's just that more basic or static measurements like SINAD, for instance, are not actually going to show you what's happening. And there are various different things where in some cases you may even have to construct a particular test in order to see what's really going on. Something basic like SINAD does not encapsulate the full behavior of a device. It's a useful measurement to have, but it's not the be-all end-all, and it's never the thing that you should use to judge a product in its entirety. And in terms of judging headphones based on a single metric, the most common issue here is target curve adherence. People taking a target curve, most commonly the Harman target, and comparing a headphone frequency response measurement to it, then describing any deviation from the target as bad, as an objective flaw. People are actually misusing the Harman target. They're misunderstanding what it represents. Many people think that the Harman target is supposed to be a single line target for absolute perfection for all listeners, that if you can meet that, that is the perfect headphone, and anything that deviates from it is therefore further away from being the perfect headphone, when that's simply not the case. The Harman curve was not meant to be a single line target for absolute perfection, let alone for all listeners. It's simply meant to be a target curve that if you can get close to, your headphone should satisfy the majority of listeners' tastes. Due to differences in not only listener preference, but also our own HRTFs, the way in which our heads and ears modify sound, and also some of the more unpredictable ways in which particular headphones can interact with us outside of our normal HRTF effects, there are many, in some cases quite significant deviations from an exact Harman response, which are not only going to be acceptable to many listeners, but for many listeners will be outright preferable. And in fact, we can show an example of this using the measurement that's on screen now. So to take something quite basic, like just the level of bass on this headphone, we can see that as we go below about 90 Hertz, there is less bass than what the Harman target says there should be. So that's objectively bad, right? We should bump that up or try and fix the headphone so that it conforms closer to the Harman target. Well, actually, not necessarily. If we look into the data from the Harman research itself, it tells us that a huge proportion of female listeners and the majority of listeners over 50 are likely to prefer that response because they prefer less bass than the Harman target itself has. And smaller percentages of people that are male or younger will also prefer less bass than the Harman target. And then conversely, in each category, there's a percentage of people that prefer more bass than the Harman target. The Harman target itself was never meant to be a single line target for absolute perfection applicable to all listeners. As Sean Olive again said, it is only a guideline that satisfies the majority of tastes. And it's an incredibly useful tool to have, but using it as an exact target and saying that even very small deviations are objectively bad is objectively incorrect. You have to factor in a degree of uncertainty, confidence intervals in the frequency response because listener preference varies and listeners' own heads vary. What might be a 2 dB bump at 3 kHz may be exactly on target for another listener. And another limitation for the Harman target is that it's quite a heavily smoothed response. It doesn't carry any narrow, fine-grained information throughout the treble that if you actually wanted to find the exact perfect response for a specific listener would be necessary. The problem is all of the narrow, fine-grained information on a given person's HRTF, the head-related transfer function, is going to be different from the rig that you are measuring on, the person sitting next to them, and the person sitting next to them. And so if you want a generally applicable, this suits the majority of tastes target, you kind of have to go for a smoothed response. But if you want a specific person's perfect response, there has to be narrow fine-grained stuff. So this is an area in which our interpretation of measurements is limited because your understanding of your own HRTF is likely somewhat limited. Those deviations that you might see in a measurement from the Harman target throughout the treble could actually be really ideal for you. A perfectly smooth response there, in fact, is not going to be ideal for you from the very nature of the fact that your HRTF is not perfectly smooth. This is why at headphones.com we don't use any single line headphone frequency response target curve to display with our measurements. Instead, we take the diffuse field HRTF neutral response of the rig which we are using to measure the headphones and compare the measured response of the headphones to that. This gives us a necessary anatomical baseline for a diffuse field neutral sound, not a preference target. In fact, the Harman research tells us why a true diffuse field neutral would generally not be preferred, but this is a necessary anatomical baseline which we can compare to and compensate to display measurements in a much more intuitive way. So instead of just looking at the shaped curve you would usually see, you can see exactly where and how the frequency response deviates from an actual diffuse field neutral response. And we apply preference bounds to this, confidence intervals, because we know that generally people prefer more bass than a true diffuse field neutral. So you can see that the preference bounds are shifted higher, and there is more variation in the bass region because we know that the variation in how much bass people prefer is wider than throughout the mid-range, for example. So the point here is that if a headphone frequency response falls within the preference bounds, it's much more likely that it is going to still suit the majority of listeners. And as it falls outside of the preference bounds, it's more likely that it's going to be objectionable or sound more colored to more listeners. But there is no single line that describes absolute perfection for everyone because we don't currently have a way to actually predict this yet. And in fact, the headphones themselves would have to be able to adapt to the listener that they are being worn by. And that actually brings us quite nicely onto problem number 2, which is that measurements are not absolute. You might look at a headphone frequency response measurement, for instance, and think that is the frequency response for this headphone. That is the truth. So if there's a 10 kilohertz peak there, that's a problem, right? And it should aim to be fixed. But what if when you measure that headphone on a different rig, that peak doesn't show up? Or when a different person listens to that headphone and they don't hear the same peak that you do, or they hear something that you don't? Does it mean that one of the rigs is broken, one of you is wrong, or one of you is deaf? Well, no, actually there's something else going on here, and it's that even after you compensate for all of the HRTF effects, all of the ways in which your head and ears or the head and ears of a rig would usually modify sound in a diffuse field or in a real environment, with headphones there can still be some unpredictable interaction between the physical construction and geometry of that headphone in close proximity to your own ears. And this is what we call HPTF variation. You can show this by measuring the same headphone on 2 different rigs or more, and then compensating each measurement to the HRTF of each individual rig. So you're taking out all of the HRTF effects and just leaving all the unpredictable stuff that was different. And as you can see here, these 2 measurements for the Headphone 2 GT disagree with each other quite significantly in various areas. On one rig, there's a fairly substantial 10 kilohertz peak, or just above that, whereas on the other one, it's pretty much not there. And this is indicative of how this headphone is going to change in behavior between listeners' heads. So if you listen to a headphone and it disagrees with what you see in a single line frequency response measurement, it doesn't mean that you're wrong or that the measurement is wrong. It's just that that measurement rig may not necessarily have been all that similar to your own head and ears. And so this is part of the reason why at headphones.com we're switching to a way of producing measurements, or displaying measurements rather, where we measure the same headphone on multiple different rigs, compensate each measurement to the HRTF of that rig, and then plot the area of variation between the two. So rather than a single line that only shows you how a headphone behaved on a single head, this measurement shows you how a headphone is likely to vary across listeners' heads, and this gives us a much better representation of the range of sounds or range of responses that listeners can expect. There's going to be a lot of people that are a little uncomfortable about this way of showing measurements versus a single line, because there's something kind of conclusive and certain about a single line. And I get that, but at the same time, any single line measurement, it doesn't matter what rig it was taken on, is not going to be directly applicable to what you get at your eardrum. And so the challenge of people arguing over how a headphone actually sounds, some people saying, no, this headphone was peaky and bright for me, and other people saying, no, it's fine, what are you on about? It's not necessarily that one of these two people is deaf, and if there's a particular measurement that supports one or the other, that those guys are right. It's not even necessarily just a difference in preference. Actually, a likely answer is that no, this headphone was producing that peak for some people, and for other people, it just was not. It's not that any of them are wrong, it's just that the measurement data we have is limited, and it doesn't capture the full spectrum of how this headphone is going to behave across different listeners' heads. And whilst we could just continue using single-line frequency response measurements and assume some level of variability between listeners, that doesn't tell us anything about how much variation a headphone is likely to have between heads or where those variations are likely to occur. And so we can take the guesswork out. We do it like this. We measure the headphone on different rigs, compensate each measurement to the HRTF of that rig, and look at where those variations remain. And we can see here, for example, that the bass response of this headphone is going to be very consistent between different listeners. As you go to that 1-2 kHz region, there is a bit more variation there, though nothing too crazy. But that 4 kHz region could vary quite substantially, creating a peak for some or being pretty flat for others, and that 10 kHz region is going to vary a lot. So now we've actually got a good picture of not just how much it's likely to vary or just guessing, but actually what the different sounds that different listeners could expect are going to be. So don't treat frequency response measurements as the exact truth, because there is some variability and mechanics behind why and how much they vary, and the better you understand those, the more use you will be able to make out of the measurement data that's available. But you also shouldn't treat source gear measurements as exact. On the screen at the moment, you can see a screenshot of part of the audio precision dashboard whilst I'm measuring a DAC, and you'll be familiar with this if you've seen DAC and amp measurements before. Usually what people will do is they'll take that SINAD score, and that's what they'll use to judge the product. But whilst it's saying here we've got a SINAD score of 122 dB, is it actually? Or was that just what it was when I checked? This is an actual recording of what was happening when I took that screenshot, and as you can see, the number is not absolute. It is not static. It's constantly changing. It drops down, in fact, to minus 119 dB for very short durations. It jumps up to nearly 123, hovering around 121, but flicking pretty constantly between 120 to 122. What is the actual SINAD score for this product? And there's not really a right answer here. Mostly it just depends on when you took the screenshot. And I mention this because a lot of people will judge products or which is better or make a purchase decision based on, in some cases, 1 dB difference in SINAD, when actually that could just have been down to when the screenshot was taken. Particularly as a product being measured is getting closer to the performance limits of the analyzer itself, you have to factor in some uncertainty to these measurements. You can't treat them as absolute because they quite simply aren't. This is not necessarily variation from the device itself. A lot of it is just down to the analyzer because we are right on the edge of the noise floor for the apx555 itself. Do not make a purchase decision and don't judge which of two products is better based on tiny differences which actually may have just been run-to-run variation. But even outside of run-to-run variation and the level of uncertainty that you should be applying to measurements of devices, there are ways in which the actual test configuration or the test equipment being used can also drastically, in some cases, influence the results that you get. So here, for example, there is the same device being measured 3 times, and you can see that the SINAD scores, just them alone, they're quite different. So on the left, we've got about 122 dB SINAD. Looking in the middle, it bumps it up to about 124. And then on the right, it drops all the way down to about minus 108 dB. And if you look at the FFT, you can see there's quite a bit more distortion as well. But the device itself has not changed. I have not changed the hardware that I was measuring. It's the same product, configured exactly the same. So why am I getting such different results? Well, the one on the left was my normal measurement setup. That's how I typically have my analyzer configured whenever I'm measuring this kind of product. And so that 122 dB score, or with a little bit of uncertainty as we just talked about, is what I would compare to other products that I have measured. The one in the middle, which was a fair bit higher at 124, nearly 125 in one channel, is an A-weighted measurement. This one's interesting because you'll quite often see manufacturers use A-weighted measurements. A-weighted measurements are an attempt to make something more perceptually relevant by weighting things depending on what frequency they're at. So around 1 kHz and a couple kilohertz either side, things are weighted more significantly, whereas higher frequencies and lower frequencies than that, so as we go towards 20 kHz or down towards 20 Hz, they're factored in a lot less. So all of the noise down at those lower frequencies and higher frequencies, any kind of mains leakage from the power supply, is factored into the SINAD score calculation significantly less than with a true unweighted measurement. And for this reason, a lot of the time A-weighted measurements will look better than unweighted measurements. And for that reason, manufacturers will often prefer to provide A-weighted specifications, because when you compare them, they look better. But the problem is you can only compare A-weighted specifications and measurements to other A-weighted specifications and measurements. You cannot compare this to an unweighted one. They aren't calculated in the same way, and this generally makes things more favorable. This isn't a bad way of doing things. A-weighting makes a lot of sense, and it's what's used for OSHA safety regulations in terms of loudness exposure, for example. There's a lot of valid reasons to use it, and it's, as said, a way to try and make things more perceptually relevant. But the point is, you need to know when something is or is not an A-weighted measurement so that you know whether you can actually compare it to another set of measurements. And then the final one on the right is an example of how a difference in test equipment or difference in configuration of your test equipment can quite drastically influence the results that you get. So this one, I disabled the notch filter on my analyzer. Usually, when you connect something to a standard ADC or interface, the signal goes straight to the ADC and it tells you what it sees. And that's also the case for a lot of different analyzers. They may have some extra features, but they are high-performance ADCs at the core. High-end analyzers will often have something called a notch filter because ADCs, just like DACs and amps, produce harmonic distortion. You could feed them a pure, no distortion whatsoever, 1 kHz tone, and they'll show some harmonic distortion because the ADCs have harmonic distortion. So the way that we get around that is by removing the 1 kHz tone entirely. Instead of feeding it the 1 kHz tone and all the noise and distortion you're trying to measure, you filter out the 1 kHz tone and feed it just the noise and distortion from the device under test. And that way, the ADC doesn't produce any harmonic distortion from that 1 kHz tone because it's not there anymore. So without that disabled, what we're actually seeing is some of the harmonic distortion produced by the ADCs in the audio precision rather than the device itself. And the combination of these two makes the measurement look worse. But even if you're doing everything right, you've got your notch filter enabled, you're using an unweighted measurement, your results can still vary a bit from both other people's measurements using the same hardware or your own older measurements, for instance, if you were configuring things slightly differently. So here's an example of that. This is an example of the same device being measured how I would usually measure it, and then once again in a simulation of a Mirrored Audio Science Review's usual measurement setup. So I'm using my analyzer, I've just configured it how he would usually configure it for this test. And you can see that the results are slightly different. We're both using the notch filter, we're both doing unweighted measurements, we're using identical hardware. So what's changed? Well, if you look down at the bottom, you can see that on mine, it says I'm using analog balanced and the bandwidth is set to AC 10 Hz to 20 kHz, whereas on Amir's, it's AC 10 Hz to 22.4 kHz. We're using slightly different bandwidths. Mine is only factoring in everything up to about 20 kHz, and his is factoring in everything up to about 22.4 kHz. So the extra distortion and noise that may be present between 20 kHz and 22.4 kHz is factored into his SINAD score, but it's not factored into mine, meaning our results are slightly different. Now, which of these is correct? It's pretty debatable. The AES-17 standard calls for you to use a 20 kHz cutoff filter, but then there's a lot of reasons why, particularly if you're measuring DACs, which have variations in oversampling filters just above 20 kHz, you may want to use 22.4. Neither of these is right, neither of these is wrong. They are just slightly different, and it's important to be aware of because particularly if you are trying to make comparisons between very small differences in scores, which again, you shouldn't be doing, but even if you are, it's important to know that unless the measurement setup is absolutely identical, you can't make comparisons quite that closely. So how do you know if you can actually compare one set of measurements to another? How do you know if even when they're using the same analyzer, they've actually got it configured the same way? This screenshot, which we normally are used to seeing, tells us the bandwidth, which is fine, but doesn't really tell us much else. Instead, you need more information. And this is a screenshot from L7 Audiolab, who produces quite a lot of source gear measurements for various different DACs and amps. And as you can see, he instead provides a screenshot for the full bench test dashboard. And this shows us a lot more. On the left, it shows us how the high pass and low pass filters are configured, whether there's any weighting being applied, how the notch filter has been configured, and what the inputs and outputs are, as well as various other things. There is a lot more information here, which we can use to see if either this measurement could be compared to someone else's, or if this can be compared to one of his own measurements. And this is really important for transparency, because without this kind of information, we don't know if tests are being done consistently or even fairly in some cases. And even when things go wrong, it's still really good that this is being shown, because it means that people can go, hey, I think this may have been done slightly incorrectly. Would you be able to correct that? Here, for instance, we can see that he's measuring a Astel & Kern SP3000 DAP, and the SINAD score is about 105 dB. But if we look at this checkbox here, which is the high performance sign analyzer, that is what Audio Precision names their notch filter, and you can see that it's not turned on. If you remember back on the slide previously, a score went from 108 dB to 122 dB when you applied the notch filter correctly. So the fact that it's not on here means we now know that we actually can't really trust that SINAD score. But the fact that he was transparent in providing this information means we can say, hey, just to let you know, this may need to be redone. Otherwise, we would have just assumed that that 105 figure is the truth when it wasn't. Now, personally, in an effort to try and keep my measurements readable, I don't usually provide the whole dashboard view because that's a bit overwhelming for most people. So I do just provide that same normal screenshot, but I then provide a full report document, which documents my entire test sequence and the exact analyzer and test setup configuration for every single test that is done. So if you ever look at my measurements and you want to know more about exactly how things were being configured for each one, you can go into this document and it gives you the full information for every single test. So measurements are not absolute. How a device is being tested has a huge impact on what the results that you get are. For headphones, the rig that you use and whether you're accounting for positional variation and doing multiple seatings, for example, has a massive impact on what the result that you're going to get is. And for source gear, how you've configured your analyzer, what analyzer you're using, and how everything is set up, again, has a drastic impact on the results and scores that you're going to see. And you should also factor in a degree of uncertainty. For headphone measurements, again, single lines aren't globally applicable. Things are going to change from head to head, and there are better ways if you have data from multiple heads in which you can show headphone measurements. And for source gear, again, for SINAD scores in particular, don't make a purchase decision or judge the performance of a product based on a 1 dB or less difference in SINAD, because it could all just be down to when that screenshot was taken. And overall, if you want to compare one measurement to another for source gear or for headphones, you have to be certain that the exact same test setup, the exact same equipment, and the exact same configuration was being used. Otherwise, you cannot make a direct comparison. So on to problem number 3 then. We don't know everything yet. Measurements provide us with a wealth of information about how a product performs, and they're incredibly useful resources for evaluating the performance of a product or trying to find products which are likely to suit our own tastes. And our understanding of both how to take better measurements and better utilize the data that we have and interpret it is only going to improve and make the measurements more useful as time goes on and as our understanding develops. But our understanding is only going to develop if more people get involved in and take an interest in objective measurements and behavior. And I don't necessarily mean taking measurements, because not everyone can afford the startup cost or the gear needed to do that, but just discussing measurements, looking at and finding interesting things about the data, correlating different subjective characteristics to different objective behaviors. Right now, our understanding of how to interpret exactly how something is going to sound based on the data we have is limited, but it's improving constantly. A long time ago, we were measuring headphones on flat plates, and now we've got very accurate head and torso simulators with fully accurate inner ear canals and everything. And even then, though, we were taking single line frequency response measurements, and now we're moving on to better ways of representing data and taking data using the same equipment by measuring on different heads and showing HBTF variation, for instance. One of the problems that we have in audio is there are a lot of questions where we are unlikely to ever get a clear, conclusive answer to them, because simply put, there's no financial incentive to do so. The reason that we have the Harman research is because answering the question of how do I make a headphone that sounds good to most people, that's a very valuable question to answer. And with it answered, you can make products that will make you back more money than it costs to do that research. But spending $100,000 getting thousands of volunteers and doing an extensive study to answer the question of, does a 2 kilohertz dip make soundstage bigger? It's a little less likely that you're going to make a return on your money from that. But the reason I bring that up in particular is because, well, you've probably heard of the soundstage dip, a dip in the frequency response around 2 kHz, which people often refer to and treat as a fact that a dip there improves the size of soundstage. It makes things sound bigger, possibly at the expense of timbre, but nonetheless, that's the effect that people report. And we have never had a study on this. We've never had anyone give a clear, conclusive answer in a controlled situation as to whether that's even a thing, let alone whether that's the specific subjective effect it has. But we can kind of do these things as a community to some extent. The reason that people sort of treat this as a fact is because as a community, we've built up enough objective data and correlations between that objective data and the subjective impressions, either from people listening to headphones that do or do not have that soundstage dip, or just EQing it in themselves to say that, yeah, we can be pretty confident that this is absolutely a thing. And there are various other areas where, despite the fact that something might make a clear, measurable difference, we don't actually know and probably won't get a conclusive answer as to what the audibility thresholds for something is. DAC oversampling filters, for instance, is one that I've talked about before because I always found that using high performance oversampling, like in the Chord products or doing it externally with tools like HQ Player and PGGB, made an audible improvement. And it makes a very clear measurable difference, but you talk about this in certain places and people will proclaim as a fact, not just that, oh, there's no proof that that makes a difference, but no, that is inaudible. You cannot hear that. But there's no evidence for that. There's no evidence that it's inaudible, and it would be as equally unscientific to proclaim as a fact that you cannot hear it as it would be for me to proclaim that it is audible, even though the only evidence I have is my own subjective experience. We're never going to get a clear and conclusive answer as to what the exact audibility thresholds for the various parameters of an oversampling filter are, because there's no financial incentive for anyone to do an extensive study on that. But to answer the question of, well, is this actually audible in the first place? I did a controlled blind ABX test, and you can go and watch this video here. I compared various different oversampling filters and showed in a controlled environment, remotely verifiable as well, I went to quite extensive lengths to make sure that that was possible, that yes, it makes a difference. Doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will be able to hear it or that it's worth the money, but it's at least audible. So it's quite important to try and keep in mind where our actual knowledge and understanding of various things are and how you might be able to improve them. Scientific progress moves forward as people engage in healthy, constructive debate and discussion. Our slightly limited understanding is not an excuse to just ignore objective data and go standing in the corner screaming, yep, this pink fuse makes a massive difference, there's no measurable difference whatsoever, and I'm not going to do a blind test, but by God it makes a difference and you're clearly an idiot or deaf if you think otherwise. That's not very helpful, it's completely unscientific, moves nothing forward, and it's just going to leave more questions than it leaves answers. But conversely, if someone comes to you with clear, quite concise data showing, look, this is the clear measurable difference this makes, here is a controlled blind test showing that it's audible, the answer shouldn't be, no, the sun moves around the earth, I'm not going to look at any data you have because that disagrees with my belief, and so I'm going to stay here. Both of these are equally unscientific, and unfortunately the issue I see in a lot of discussion nowadays around audio measurements and objective data is that people on both sides are drifting away from having a healthy, constructive discussion. If you think someone's wrong, don't just scream at them that they're wrong. Tell them some controls that they could implement into a blind test to actually get an answer. Tell them some things that they could do to try and find out why this might be the case or if there's something else going on, and try and have a reasonable discussion. Both sides just screaming, you're wrong and you're dumb, is not helping anyone. But there's one other thing which you need to be careful of, which is that if someone comes to you with data or with something that looks quite scientific, answering a question you might have had, like, do cables make a difference, for example, don't just trust it implicitly because it looks scientific. Read it through, see what you think, see if you can poke holes in it and find issues or flaws, and see what other people are saying as well. The reason that the peer review process exists for scientific papers isn't because there's a group of people that are going, I'm going to find a way to make sure that paper doesn't get out. It's to try and find issues in the paper, poke holes in it so that they can be corrected, so that the conclusions can be conclusive. If you've got holes in your methodology and you leave more questions unanswered than you answer, then no one can actually trust what your conclusions are because there's a billion different explanations as to how you could have got those results or how you could have got that conclusion. Things have to be rigorous in order to be conclusive. The reason why a blind test where you're still in the room and you can still hear them unplugging and plugging things, but you can't see, so it's fine. Well, it's not fine. It's not a blind test. You might be blindfolded, but if there are other ways besides just listening to the music that you could have told which device was in use, then it's not a properly controlled test, and unfortunately the results are invalid. Things have to be rigorous in order to get conclusive answers. This paper, called An Electrical Study of Single-Ended Analog Interconnect Cables by Milind and Kuncha, I'm bringing up because it's unfortunately quite a good example of this, and it's also been referenced by various different audio channels recently. And that's because it shows various different measured differences between audio cables. And so a lot of people have taken this and gone, see, cables make a difference, here's clear measured proof and here's a paper on it. But the problem is, well, there's a lot of problems. This paper is not exactly as conclusive as one might think. I'm not going to go too into detail on this because actually Amirad Audio Science Review already has a great video going through pretty much all the issues in this paper. There is a link to that in the description. Don't watch it now, watch it later. But the core issue with this paper, as well as the issues in the methodology and test setup and the fact that no one can repeat it because none of the cables used were documented at all, but also just the fact that all of the issues being shown and the differences being measured were transmission line effects at massively high frequencies, things that we not only already understand how these work and how these occur. That's why this BNC cable has a rated characteristic impedance of 75 ohms, for example, why you have to use specific cables for connecting a clock to a DAC, and why my scope has a particular specific impedance termination option for this reason exactly. But it's being incorrectly applied to audio where none of this makes sense. None of these effects occur in audio frequencies, and none of the tests being done used audio frequencies. They were all at gigahertz ranges. Amir's got a great video on that paper. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. And in fact, I'm not even going to re-record this take because quite frankly, I don't think that paper deserves any more time. So our understanding is still somewhat limited, and that's neither an excuse to be lazy nor an excuse to be complacent. It's a reason to engage more in healthy, middle ground, constructive discussion. That's how things move forward. And talking of moving forward, I wanted to leave you with a couple interesting areas in which we've made some pretty cool progress recently. This first one actually kind of blew my mind a bit, but there's a study which has been done which shows that human hearing can beat the Fourier uncertainty principle. Now, what that means is that our ability with our ears to discern the timing of a note, which of two notes came first, and the frequency of a note simultaneously is in some cases up to 10 times better than the limit imposed by the Fourier uncertainty principle, what we're able to do with standard linear mathematics. And that shows that our brains, our ears are doing some weird nonlinear processing that we do not fully understand or have an accurate model for yet. Now, that's pretty interesting, and it just goes to show that we have a little bit of a ways to go to understand where the exact limits of our human hearing capabilities are. But for now, I just thought that was pretty interesting. And to kind of bring this all the way back round to where we started, talking about how SINAD and total harmonic distortion are not particularly perceptually relevant measurements, the lazy answer there would be, well, total harmonic distortion doesn't really tell me much, so I'm just going to completely ignore measurements from here on out and just use my ears. The scientific and constructive way would be to understand that limitation, accept it, and think, how can we improve on it? How can we make a better metric that does tell us more about how that distortion in music is going to be perceived? And that's exactly what this paper does. I'll link to it in the description, and they've created two new metrics, DS and R non-lin, using some fairly complex methodology. The filter banks that they're using on one in particular is kind of nuts. But the point is that both of these new metrics correlated significantly better with the perceived subjective amount of distortion in a complex music stimulus than traditional metrics like total harmonic distortion. So don't just look at measurements, or if you do or have to, understand where the limitations of measurements are. And that means that you should both not just take a frequency response measurement for a headphone and assume that you're going to get the same result on your own head, but also understand that you're not necessarily going to get a drastic variation that'll suddenly make it perfect, even if the measurement looks very wonky. Understanding the limitations of the measurements on both ends is important to actually accurately interpreting measurements. And as measurements get better, things like HPTF variation measurements, for example, that's only going to get easier. Conversely, don't just use your ears, not in the least because our ears are fallible. That's the reason why we have to do blind testing in order to tell if something is actually audible in the first place. Placebo and expectation bias affect every single person. It doesn't matter how good your hearing is, how rich you are, how old you are, how well trained you are or experienced you are. These issues affect all of us. But also, if we forego measurement and objective data entirely, then we are wandering in the dark. We will not learn how to make better products and find out what works, what doesn't, how to improve things, and we won't be able to even use existing data to buy products which are more likely to suit our tastes because everyone's ignoring it and doesn't understand it. Ask questions, get curious, and get involved. The more people that do, the more things will progress. More healthy, constructive discussion, debate, and criticism is how things progress, not two people standing on opposite sides of the room refusing to talk to each other. And so I'm going to leave you with a quote from Jason Stoddard of Shit Audio, which I like quite a lot, which is that all of audiophilia is a search for the perfect distortion profile. Not the lowest distortion, the perfect distortion profile. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you've got any questions, which I'm sure there's going to be a fair few, leave them in the comments or come and say hey on the headphones.com forum or the headphones.com Discord server. I'm GoldenSound, you're watching The Headphone Show by headphones.com. I'll see you next time.